black.
Oh, good. Excellent. And so many other.
Bird Conservation Network. So many other wonderful folks have contributed to this project. So I'm really excited to share with y'all. Like I mentioned, like was mentioned a second ago, I'm a ecologist, educator, and illustrator. I love to use my artwork to share any of the messages that I'm trying to communicate surrounding research, surrounding conservation, surrounding environmental justice work. I try to have my birds, my plants, anything that I draw, have some sort of positive impact in this world. But I want to just dive on into one of these particular birds. So, show of hands, who is familiar with this lovely critter, the black crowned heron? Okay, so good, most everybody is pretty familiar with this. Did y'all know that Chicago, just a little south of here, actually has the largest breeding population of these birds in the state of Illinois? And right in the heart of Chicago. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. It's pretty incredible. But I'm going to get into that in just a second. Wanted something to bring in. The black crowned heron, scientific name Nyctocorax, which comes from the Greek night raven. It's one of my favorite scientific names, is a globally distributed and largely migratory medium-bodied wading bird. As its name implies, this is actually one of the world's only nocturnal species of herons, including others such as the yellow-crowned night heron, one of the other night heron species that we have here in the United States. In Illinois, these guys are largely migratory, typically breeding with us. You see illustrated here. With the purple in these maps from Cornell's website. There's quite a lot of North America and Central America in which these birds are year-round residents. And while typically in Illinois we see the vast majority of our birds migrating south for the winter to lands unknown, but that's part of the story, we do typically have about 10-15% of the population sticking with us in Chicago. And especially some of the hatchier birds, some of the birds that are a little younger and haven't really learned and established those migratory behaviors. When I say that this is a medium-bodied wading bird, I mean that it's also, comparatively to other wading birds, it's a little kind of right in the middle there. And this is a really opportunistic and upper-level consumer. And what I mean by upper-level consumer is illustrated by this little, very rudimentary food chain here. It just means that it's at the top of the food chain. It eats things that eats things that eats things that eats plants, right? So with it being positioned at the top of the food chain, black crowned herons and other higher level consumers like great blue herons and other wading birds are really crucial for ecosystems because they help move nutrients and energy pretty continuously. Having upper level consumers in different ecosystems typically means that those ecosystems are doing really well, are really quite healthy. They breed in a huge variety of habitats. I am from Atlanta, Georgia, originally, and I grew up visiting quite a lot of course, Georgia's coast as well as the Panhandle of Florida. Really worked all and around South Florida, especially. I worked in the Everglades for a good number of years studying American white ibis in urban settings, actually. So urban wading bird ecology is something that I am pretty intimately familiar with, and I love seeing these birds not only in beautiful ex-urban wetland habitats, but then also being able to see them at the St. Augustine Alligator Farm with one of the most beautiful mixed flock rookeries that I've ever seen in my life. I love seeing American white ibis in beautiful manicured parks in Palm Beach, Florida. I love seeing our beautiful night herons right in the center of Lincoln Park. These birds are extremely adaptive and, as I was saying, can breed in a variety of different areas. Typically, these birds take about 3 years to reach full maturation, with, of course, this image here on the left, as well as my illustration representing an adult black crowned night heron, and then this lovely beautiful bird with brown and white speckled patternings being a juvenile bird. They hatch out, grow pretty darn quickly to full adult size, but they'll take about 3 years or so to molt and acquire that full adult plumage.
Color?
Yeah.
So
sure is.
One day it's yellow, the next day it's red, or does it go through a transition and it's kind of orangey, and then, or what goes on there?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. For those on Zoom who maybe didn't hear it, the question was, sorry, what was your name? Bob noticed that the image of this juvenile night heron, the eyes are yellow, and the eyes of the adults are very, very striking ruby red. And so the question was, is that kind of a day-to-day change, or is that something that changes more gradually over time? The answer is the latter. It kind of changes as they mature, with adult night herons having that striking blood red coloration. There's a few different species in the bird world that have those bright red eyes, and some of them are diurnal, some of them are nocturnal. So some people hypothesize that the night heron's eye color is because of its nocturnality. Maybe not necessarily the case, but it does mean for sure that it is highly vascularized. It has a ton of blood vessels in that eye, so it means that it is constantly pumping a ton of beautiful oxygen-rich blood into its eyes. So it just means that it has really, really healthy and very competent eyesight. Some other red-eyed individuals, of course, I know our grackles have some pretty crazy eye colors, as well as our wood ducks might be the other species that I can think of that has that particular eye color. Here in the state of Illinois, despite the fact that these birds are actually the world's most widely distributed heron species, they occur on every single continent except for Antarctica and Australia. These birds have been imperiled in the Midwest for a good number of decades. They were actually first listed as state endangered in Illinois beginning in 1977, and have likewise been listed as state endangered in Indiana, Pennsylvania, Maine, and as a species of conservation concern in other states like New York. And this is largely due to the processes that we can see illustrated here by these maps provided by the Nature Conservancy. So to narrate them a little bit, the map on the left side here is mostly a matrix of beautiful prairie and forest ecosystems. Prairies being denoted in that kind of caramel coloration, and then of course that the forest being that deep, beautiful green. Over the past couple hundred years in processes of colonialization, industrial expansion, and agricultural expansion, we have lost roughly 99% of Illinois' prairie habitats and roughly 90% of Illinois' wetland habitats. And of course, for medium-bodied wading birds, such as the black-crowned night heron, losing 90% of your main breeding and foraging habitats is going to be a real sticking point for you, right, as a species. So this is largely the just loss of habitat over the years has been the main driver of these birds populations being in decline for the past several decades. And as I was mentioning earlier, with these birds being positioned at the top of the food chain, that has significant implications for trophic, being just kind of general nutrient energy, carbohydrates, right, moving through ecosystems, as well as other nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus. Basically the idea of, ecology can kind of be thought as a big game of Jenga, right? And any potential removal of a brick can bring the whole thing crashing down, right? Apex predators such as black-crowned night herons are a pretty big brick in the whole system. Historically in Illinois, the black-crowned night heron used to number in the thousands and thousands. Breeding populations could number from 1,600 to 2,000 individuals, and these birds typically nested in areas just southeast of Chicago proper, in the Lake Calumet region that extended into... Oh, of course I did. Of course I unplugged the microphone with my wild gesticulation. Okay. Can folks on Zoom hear me okay now? I think I just saw the thing go back. Okay, yeah, I think we're back. Let me try to not do that again. These birds were nesting in these areas southeast of Chicago proper. Fabulous. Okay, good. For time in memoriam, again, with breeding populations numbering about 2,000 birds. And unfortunately, again, due to these processes of agricultural expansion, industrial expansion, et cetera, these birds really began abandoning these historic breeding sites in the Lake Calumet region in the early 2000s. Jeff Levengood is a researcher who is the last person that I know of to have done, especially environmental health and wildlife health work with these birds in the Calumet region, and that was in about 2004. And since then, these birds have not been found to be breeding in these historic areas. But we have still seen these birds, not only surviving, but I think thriving. And I think that the rest of this presentation will illustrate just how well this population is doing, which is wonderful, in this beautiful urbanized matrix that looks very, very different from, these areas, these wetlands, these historic ex-urban breeding and foraging sites, right? And it really brings up the point that, most people, I would say, most of us think that urban areas are not going to be the most welcoming to wildlife. They're not particularly welcoming of biodiversity. They don't really help promote it. But Chicago, in which we really, I think, invest a lot. There's certainly more that we can be investing in, but in this region, we invest a lot of time, energy, and care into our urban green spaces. And so when these places are managed with wildlife in mind, of course, wildlife can thrive, right? And this is not the first time that black horned herons have really established urban colonies in the United States, actually. There are many long-standing colonies in major urban areas, such as New York City. There is a long-standing population of breeding night herons in New York Harbor. It's even the city official bird of Oakland, California, where they similarly have been nesting in and around the Oakland Zoo for decades. And even when, they needed to move around the trees that the birds were nesting in, they were seen perching and hanging out on all of the earth movers. These are really resilient, kind of unfappable birds. They really can just deal with a lot, it seems. And this is not the only species that has urbanized in past many decades. We see great egrets, great blue herons, American white ibis, such as these birds that are some of my personal birds. I don't know if you can see it, but they have some little colored leg bands down there that either myself or one of my colleagues put on them at some point in 2013, 14, 15, et cetera. We have a lot of great examples of wading birds adapting really beautifully to urban areas. And I want to just kind of back up real quick because there, as I was mentioning, a lot of folks don't really think of cities as areas that are particularly welcoming to wildlife. And so I kind of want to just define a few things real quickly of what exactly, is urban wildlife ecology, right? I work at the Urban Wildlife Institute. My colleagues and I all study this subject. And in short, it's a study of how wildlife, be it plants, animals, fungi, et cetera, interact with each other and their environment in urban landscapes, right? We're trying to understand what kind of relationships they're building because in terms of, geological history, urban spaces have been around for this much of it, right? Not a lot of time. So these are novel relationships that are being developed every single day. And so that's kind of one of the many, many reasons why I find urban wildlife ecology to be so fascinating is we're literally trying to understand new ways that we are living with each other in urban areas, as well as how wildlife is living with each other and us in urban areas. And in urban areas, it begs the question, are urban areas all bad for wildlife? And I'm not trying to say that, it's actually all rainbows and cupcakes and it's all been a lie and this whole time in urban areas are great for wildlife. I'm not saying that. But there is a lot of nuance to that question, right? There are some unique benefits that outweigh the costs of living in urban areas for some species. And for other species, those benefits cannot outweigh the costs of living in urban areas. But again, it's very unique and it's very species specific. So again, absolutely, urbanization can increase wildlife densities and introduce novel stressors, right? Light pollution, air pollution, sound pollution. These are all things that we know, especially relevant to birds, but of course not just birds. We know that these are stressors that are can be very, very impactful of wildlife and can sometimes, decrease population sizes or increase the prevalence of diseases in certain populations. But there are also some really cool benefits to living in urban areas, especially for wading birds. Urban areas can actually provide really sick foraging sites. Birds love to use urban harbors, for instance, that kind of deposition of nutrients from, say, a golf course or a lawn or an urban park brings a lot of fish into these urban harbors and just kind of sets out a whole buffet for wading birds, such as the black-crowned heron. Also, urban areas provide unique experiences and unique relationships such that, this fox might be able to, because it's not preying on this mouse or this meadow vole, it might be able to avoid this really nasty lungworm that it contracts from eating those particular prey species because it's too busy dumpster diving. And sure, maybe the food in the dumpster isn't ideal for it, but maybe outweighs the cost of getting that infection from this Echinococcus flatworm. So again, it's all about, with urban ecology, it's all about thinking expansively. It's kind of frequently going to be a little bit of, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And it's important just kind of constantly be asking, how much of it is the good, how much of it is the bad, how much of it is the ugly, and how do all of those factors add up to equate to, kind of the experience of these different birds. Or sorry, all these different wildlife, but I am focusing on these birds in particular. So to zoom back in real quick to the black crown-eyed herons, right? I was saying that they kind of started moving away from their historic nesting sites in the Calumet region around 2000, in the early 2000s, around 2004 or so. And it was around 2007, much before my time. I came up to Chicago in 2021, largely to work with these birds. That was kind of one of the big draws for me. But much before my time in 2007, that's when folks initially started seeing these birds settling in Lincoln Park. And they have had three major nesting areas in Lincoln Park that they've used over the years. This being kind of the first one, demarcated by the yellow star. This is where the major allay used to be in Lincoln Park. So if y'all are a little less familiar with the kind of landscape of Lincoln Park, used to be this beautiful row of pretty large mature ash trees that the herons just loved. Unfortunately, those trees had to be taken down later on because they were succumbing to emerald ash borer. And I'll show you the data in a little bit. It seems like the data is suggesting that the birds were well aware of those trees declining and kind of started moving away from that nesting habitat even before humans needed to come in and intervene for public safety reasons. They've also nested at the Lincoln Stanley Memorial and Couch Tomb, just a little south of the allay. And then in recent years, beginning really with earnest in 2015, the majority of this population, now the entirety of this population, has been nesting at the Lincoln Park Zoo's Pritzker Family Children's Zoo. So that's kind of how the zoo ties into all of this in a really big way. We do essentially provide the seasonal breeding home for this wonderful population of birds. So again, I was alluding to this data here. You can kind of see how these birds have prioritized the three major nesting areas throughout time. Again, our data only goes back to 2010, but again, records have shown that these birds started coming to Lincoln Park as early as 2007. And they started using some of those, the two other nesting habitats, starting in about 2012. That's when we first saw birds arriving at the Lincoln Park Zoo, as well as Couch Tomb. And then over the years, they really just honed in on the Pritzker Family Children's Zoo as their main base of operations. And this really immediately followed the success, a really great, I think, urban wildlife, urban green space success story in the Nature Boardwalk. How many of y'all are familiar with the Nature Boardwalk in Lincoln Park? So really quickly, Nature Boardwalk, as you can see by these photographs on the right here, is a really beautiful prairie and restored wetland habitat in the heart of Lincoln Park. It's about 14 acres. I have the immense pleasure of conducting regular research down there and teaching my students. So I supervise roughly 6 different internships over the summer. And this is kind of our living laboratory that I teach my students how to do bird monitoring, how to conduct point counts, how to sample different wildlife species. And I run an avian biodiversity monitoring project out of there too with a number of amazing community members. So we've documented about 133 bird species just in this one particular natural area. And in 2010, it was converted from this very austere classic urban park that was mostly just turf grass and concrete. It was transformed into this luscious ecosystem that you see again here depicted on the right. That process was completed in 2010, which is again when we started really to see the black crown-eyed herons flourishing in Lincoln Park. So we like to think that this is a big part of their overall success story. But I want to zoom back in to the Pritzker Family Children's Zoo and where the colony is now. So they have really settled again at this particular area of the zoo and really right above the red wolf habitat. We have 2 red wolves in our care, and their favorite neighbors during the spring and summer are our black-crowned night herons and vice versa. And this may seem a little counterintuitive to many. Why in the heck would this bird want to nest over an apex predator species? And there's this really, really cool ecological theory called mesocarnivore release theory that pertains to this. So to break that down a little bit, mesocarnivore, middle, carnivore, something that eats meat, right? So kind of a smaller bodied, a middle bodied carnivore like a raccoon or an opossum. A lot of these mesocarnivores are pretty arboreal and can easily clamber up a tree or swim out to a cattail flotilla bed, and just decimate wading bird populations, right? And so in many instances, wading birds will kind of identify a very large predator species, such as the American alligator, as depicted with this great egret here in the photograph on the right, or in the night heron's case, our beautiful red wolves, and they kind of act as something of a bodyguard. There's some really fabulous research that's come out of Florida showcasing how wading birds actively choose breeding habitats that are closer to alligators than those that are further away from alligators, when especially they cannot access island nesting habitats. When they can't get far away from a mainland, they'll kind of opt for a bodyguard. And so these birds are smack dab in the middle of the city. They're on something resembling, it's kind of like an urban island, but to them, they're not an island. They need some extra protection. So that was kind of one of our major hypotheses about, why these birds may be nesting above the red wolf habitat, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. Because in addition to the research that we do, a lot of my job is just simply conducting the management of this population and interacting with natural resources, providing population counts, et cetera, et cetera. So the breeding season for these birds lasts from March through August. And we try to conduct censuses roughly 2 to 3 times a week, my team and I, and we just go in there and we pick a tree and we look up and we count how many birds there are and we move on to the next tree. And I know that sounds maybe a little tedious because there are about 400 trees back there, but over the past 4 years, I've had the immense pleasure of coming to know this population pretty darn well. And so I know which trees they really love in particular in terms of just being able to go in and quickly, count them up. We also provide fencing around areas of sensitivity, as well as putting mulch down on the concrete pathways, especially under areas of high nesting density, because there's a lot of occupational hazards when you're a heron. Falling out of the nest is kind of something that's going to happen to at least 1, if not 2 chicks out of the clutch. And so we just try to provide a little mulching to cushion that fall a little bit. And then for chicks such as these that are pictured here on the bottom left, that fall the nest too early and meet certain criteria, which I can get into later on if you're interested. If they meet certain criteria, then we can transport them to, I know that the name has changed, the DuPage County Wildlife Center, previously known as Willowbrook Wildlife Center. And they will rehab those individuals for us, and then we'll, collaborate. We'll band them. We'll take some samples before these are released in different green spaces in and around Chicago area. So how have these birds been doing over the past several years? In short, pretty darn well. So this graph is representing just really simply the numbers of adult night herons and hatch year or juvenile night herons that we document on an annual basis. And this population has been consistently growing since we began taking data on them in 2010. And I think that the really exciting thing, from kind of a population ecology perspective, is that the number of hatch year birds has really been consistently increasing since 2010. And so this kind of, question.
Basis. Do the populations fluctuate? Are they coming and going or dying and birthing or what?
That's a fabulous question. What was your name?
Evan.
Evan asked the question, especially for folks on Zoom, why do we conduct censuses multiple times a week? Is it because the population is fluctuating so much? And in short, the answer is yes, especially during the peak of the breeding season. I would say in April and May, there can be enormous influxes of birds in which, I've documented in the past, between 2 days, that maybe an extra 200 or so birds can join the colony. So it's really during, specific times throughout the year when a lot of the adults are really coming in full force to the colony. It's really, especially in like May and June, when hatch rates are kind of at their peak, that the numbers can change really, really drastically on a day-to-day basis. So we really want to stay on top of that, basically, just to have the best population information possible so that it can also inform what kind of research questions we want to ask, which kind of is the perfect segue of, we see that these birds have been doing very, very well in this urban environment, and that's all well and good, but we as conservationists want to be able to perpetuate that goodness, right? So in order to do so, we need to find out what are all the reasons as to why these birds have been doing so well in Chicago. And again, how can we kind of just support them? So we really wanted to, in order to, understand why they're doing so well in Chicago and how we can better support this endangered species, we needed to come up with a series of research questions. And I say we, referring to myself, all of my colleagues at the Urban Wildlife Institute, all of my colleagues at University of Illinois Bird Conservation, all of this wonderful network of folks that I mentioned earlier. And some of the major questions for us are, where are these animals going? I showed you a map earlier of their migratory routes, right? And while that, remains true and accurate to the entire species in North America, we don't know where these particular birds are going during the winter. And for migratory bird conservation to really be effective, we not only have to be preserving the habitats in their breeding areas, but as well as their overwintering areas. So to do that, we got to know where they're going first. How healthy are these birds? This is a very, very broad question, but as a wildlife disease ecologist, I'm interested, of course, in relevant pathogens such as avian influenza. That's, of course, been a hot button topic for, many, many decades, but it's so in recent years. As well as, investigating for other pathogens, hemoparasites, things that cause day-to-day maladies that maybe you don't see as acutely as avian influenza, but might be impacting their longevity, their health over a more chronic period of time. What sort of habitats, be it on the micro or the macro scale, are they selecting for? Can we better understand which sorts of, foraging areas in the city they really, really love, so that we can kind of, see what kind of landscapes those are and how we can kind of reproduce those in Chicago and beyond? How does health interact with the way, that they are selecting for these different habitats? So these are 4 of our big research questions that I'm going to try and zip through some of our initial findings that we've been working on really since 2022. So this is a project about 3 years in the making. Question, Evan?
Yes, you talked about predators.
Yeah.
Do the other herons eat?
Evan asked for really fatty predators, and I can get into a little bit more of the details later on. Short answer is yes. So within the species, black crown-eyed herons can be kind of pugnacious with one another. They'll get into scuffles and they'll kind of quack at each other and bark, and but overall they're pretty copacetic. These are typically pretty solitary animals that really only spend time with conspecifics during the breeding season. The real issue with interspecific competition comes into play when you have mixed species colonies. And so double-crested cormorants, great blue herons, some of those other species that I mentioned as really excellent urban adapters are the big bullies on the block when it comes to colonial nesting wading birds. So the fact that this endangered species has been able to establish a kind of monospecific flock for themselves, it's actually really wonderful, and it ties into part of our work, which is conspecific attraction work. How do we get these birds to be breeding in not just Lincoln Park, but other areas in Chicago and beyond? How do we kind of reintroduce them to these historic breeding habitats? And how can we help them avoid getting outcompeted by, say, cormorants and great blue herons? So we'll touch on that in a little bit, but it's a fabulous question. So again, we've built over the years, again, since about 2022 is when we really started it. That was when we first that's when we banded our first black crown-eyed heron that has been banded since they moved to Chicago. So that was really, really exciting. But we've built this incredible team comprised of some amazing scientists, some amazing scientific communicators, and I'll give a shout out to my really good friend and recently graduated grad student, Sarah Slayton, from the University of Illinois. She now is full-time in the city, which is great to have her here. Sammy Cavendall, pictured here, one of my absolute favorite scientific educators, and he was one of my interns last year. Julia Knotts, also from University of Illinois, and this fabulous group, which is led by Amy Lardner, the Chicago Black Crown-eyed Heron Project. So these are just a few of the amazing faces that are part of this collaborative research and conservation team. And so to dive into some of the work, I'm going to start off by talking about habitat selection. So really trying to understand, what is it about the habitat at the red wolf exhibit in particular do they love so much, and how can we see those characteristics replicated across different urban green spaces? One of the first big questions that we were trying to ask is, are they really selecting for proximity to the red wolf exhibit? The short answer is yes. This map that I was able to make in QGIS clearly shows, this is basically showcasing nest density of the entirety of the black crown-eyed heron colony. I went in and counted every single tree and every single nest and every single tree that didn't have a nest to be able to make this map. And in short, the epicenter of the colony is right above the red wolf habitat. So that really, I think, showcases just how much they are selecting for proximity to this kind of protector species, as it were. And this past summer, to kind of supplement this, one of my interns conducted a really cool camera-based research project, basically trying to see how mesocarnivores like raccoons, coyotes, and opossums can be found throughout the rest of the zoo campus, and if they are really avoiding the black crown-eyed heron areas. And we had 12 different cameras set up around Lincoln Park Zoo, and we documented raccoons, skunks, coyotes, lots of different species, and we didn't have a single mesocarnivore detection back in the children's zoo. It was a short sample period, but again, it really alludes to the fact that these red wolves, as well as the black bears that are, that are housed on the southern end of the children's zoo, do seem to be protective environment for these birds, which is really fabulous. So we know that they have this really beautiful relationship with our red wolves, right? We also wanted to find out, do they have any tree species that they really just seem to love? Because again, as we're informing habitat management and restoration, we want to kind of have a short list of trees that these birds are going to really, really love and be useful not only to them, but to the other species as well. And so again, through counting and making some really fabulous statistical models with the help of my fabulous colleague, Mason Fedino, we were able to find that of the 40 or so species of trees that are back in the Pritzker Family Children's Zoo, which kind of is trying to recreate a woodland ecosystem native to Illinois, there are 6 tree species in particular that these birds are selecting for more so than the other 39 or so tree species back there. And that includes river birches, common hackberries, American hornbeam, sugar maples, red maples, and white mulberry trees. So a lot of trees that have a lot of beautiful ecological value to not only black crown-eyed herons, but to other species as well. Of course, producing nuts and seeds and fruits that tons of different species love to forage on. So this is really fabulous information to kind of, tuck in our back pocket for management's sake down the line. And I want to talk a little bit more about, I was saying in Chicago, we really do just have, I think, a beautiful conservation ethic when it comes to our urban green spaces and how we approach them, how we manage them, how we appreciate them. That doesn't mean that there is not a ton of room for improvement in terms of environmental justice and green space distribution throughout Chicago. So noting this map here on the right side, this is basically the distribution of urban tree canopy cover throughout the city of Chicago. And you can see these major blaring open areas in kind of city center and especially on the south side. So not only are there major patches in urban tree canopy cover, on average, Chicago is also super duper below the national average for urban tree canopy coverage. And of course, that is going to exacerbate issues such as air pollution, urban heat island effect. It's going to have disproportionate exposure of certain human communities to environmental toxins, excessive heat, et cetera, et cetera. And so as we kind of think about how can wildlife conservation as intersectional and as beneficial to as many organisms as possible, humans included. We think, wow, wouldn't it be fabulous to be able to collaborate with some of the amazing groups that are working on environmental equity and tree canopy coverage throughout Chicago to say, as we're building better urban tree canopy coverage for people, let's also think about how we can make it as beneficial for wildlife as possible. So again, we can kind of pull out that little short list of preferred tree species that they probably also have on their radar too. You know, I'm excited to see how all of this can potentially come together. I also think when it comes to, you know, the management of these species, we got to get a little creative, right? In terms of encouraging to them to be certain areas and discouraging them to be certain places about competition with other species. One of the big, you know, ways that we throughout conservation kind of attract birds to nest in areas are these nesting platforms. Black-eyed herons, unfortunately, don't really love those nesting platforms, and it's pretty easy for them to be outcompeted by species such as the great blue heron and double-crested. Love those nesting platforms. So it also kind of beg the question, can we engineer a nesting platform that better resembles some of these favorite tree species of theirs through 3D modeling, through LiDAR data, and producing these 3D models of, say, a fake river birch or a fake common hackberry, something that would be structurally more appealing to a black-eyed heron, maybe a little less appealing to, say, a great blue heron. So there's a lot of creativity that we want to put into this work using the data that we already have. So other chapter of our work is the foraging and migratory movement. So this has been, I would say, where the brunt of our efforts have gone into the past 3 or so years. Between 2024 and 2022, we have been able to ban about 74 black-eyed herons, and in 2024 specifically, we were able to ban and put GPS transmitters on 17 adult birds. And then in 57 of those 74 were hatchier birds. And this has become now one of the largest black-eyed heron studies, I believe, to date in the world, which is something that I think we're all extremely proud of. And we have some really fabulous movement data that has a lot of detail concerning the different urban areas that these birds love to be foraging in. So with the map on the left here, every single star is basically a major foraging spot that one of our birds has been documented going to repeatedly, right? But the 4 spots that I have circled and labeled here, being from bottom to top, Douglas Park, the Wild Mile, Montrose Harbor, and River Park, these are areas that are being disproportionately visited by our birds that we put GPS transmit units on. We were also able to find that of the birds in our colony, a decent amount of them are non-breeding and will actually travel many, many miles to forage and then come back to the colony, upwards of 30 or so miles. But on average, our birds that are breeding at the colony, they will only 4 miles away from the colony in order to forage. And then as we're thinking about, you know, how can we provide the best habitat for breeding birds, we have this really beautiful buffer around Lincoln Park, and that's something that informs the way that we conduct management. Great. That's cool. Okay. Can folks on Zoom, if I just promise to speak really loudly, are you all able to hear me okay? Just by a thumbs up, are y'all still able to hear me all right? Sorry, folks. Okay. Yes, we can hear very well. Okay, beautiful. I'm glad. Just let me know if that changes at any point, and I'm gonna just kind of stand near close to my computer here. Okay, cool. So we have a lot of really beautiful information as it pertains to kind of servicing birds that are breeding in Chicago. And I think that we've achieved a lot, and it's beautiful to share this information with folks. If we address the map on the right side of the screen here, we've been able to characterize the full migratory pathways of 4 of our birds. And I imagine that some of you are probably thinking, well, you put 17 GPS transmitter units out, why do you only have 4 birds? Unfortunately, technology will do as technology does, microphone and GPS. not exempted here. A number of our units just crapped out or fell off, unfortunately, such as it goes with movement ecology. So we're really grateful that we did get as high quality data for these four individuals as we did, because they showcase such different ecological approaches to migration, I think. Each one of them having a unique pathway that they utilize throughout the non-breeding season. So I'll first just address, we have one bird that just goes right down, I believe it's A50. Travels maybe, 300 or 400 miles overwintering in Western Kentucky. But then we have some birds such as A23 that goes all the way down to Louisiana, specifically the New Orleans area. So that's roughly, I think, about 1,300 miles it flies. But then we have some even more long distance migrants. A24, she's kind of our poster child. She is a breeding mother who has had successfully 2 clutches with us the past couple of years. We have a lot of really fabulous data on that bird in particular. So she's kind of our mascot, as it were. And then we have this one individual, I think it's A39, is our one of our international birds and overwinters in Cuba, migrating almost 3,000 miles to get to its overwintering site. So in terms of management and cooperative, conservation work, there's a lot of opportunity for us to communicate with land managers and other avian conservationists in Kentucky, Kentucky, Florida, Louisiana, Cuba, even to be able to talk about ways that we can mutually strategize for conserving overwintering habitats for black red herons and other migratory birds. So it's really fabulous to be able to better understand where these birds are moving, what sort of habitats they are selecting for, and we still have yet to kind of put all of the data together in terms of movement as well as habitat selection. So one of the goals for myself and my research team in 2026 is to go to a lot of these stars here and just be like, okay, what is the biodiversity of trees in that particular area, in this particular area, in this particular area, and kind of synthesize that and be like, what is the ideal urban foraging site for these night herons, and how can we make more foraging sites look like that? Oh, come on now.
They don't follow flyways or anything?
So generally speaking, Evan had another great question of do night herons generally follow migratory flyways? I think in general, yes. I mean, we have some good examples, I would say here, of sticking pretty much to the Mississippi flyway. And then, we have some birds that cut over eastward a little bit and more so follow that eastern flyway. So I mean, sample size of 4, it's pretty limited. But so far it seems like they're following some sort of major migratory route, even if they're kind of cutting across the country a little bit to link up with a different route. And then I think to kind of start wrapping up on reporting what we've been able to find, I'll talk a little bit about heron health. So as mentioning earlier, one of the big questions is how healthy is this population, right? And that's a huge, very, very broad question, right? And it can have many, many different components, but some of the things that we were really interested in looking at were, of course, high pathogenicity avian influenza. This has been causing a lot of issues in our poultry industry, a lot of concerns with waterfowl populations. And we're really interested to know if these particular birds seem to be susceptible or if they carry this pathogen but don't necessarily seem to get sick. So that was one of the major things that we were interested in. Hemoparasites being blood parasites that can cause more chronic health issues. We were interested to see what prevalences would be like for those. Bacterial pathogens such as salmonella. Toxic metals, that was a big one that we were interested in looking into. Jeff Levengood, that researcher that I mentioned earlier, that's a lot of what his research was diving into. Just contaminant levels of heavy metals, selenium, arsenic, copper, etc., in night heron populations. So I was super interested in being able to kind of get a comparative study going there. And then also finally, looking at dietary stable isotopes. When we eat carbohydrates, some carbon is preserved in our blood from those carbohydrates. And when we eat proteins, some nitrogen is preserved in our blood from eating those proteins. And you can kind of look at the ratio of carbon to nitrogen and make general assumptions about okay, this particular individual is eating a lot of protein and not a lot of carbs, or this individual is eating a lot of carbohydrates and less protein, right? And that is different. The ideal, ratio is different depending on what species it is. So we were thinking maybe these birds are also accessing a lot of anthropogenic or human-provided food substances. Are they going dumpster diving pretty frequently for, say, a bagel, and therefore would maybe have more carbon? Or are they really sticking to these urban fisheries and they would have just a ton of nitrogen in their blood because they're mostly eating protein? So far, we have some results here. Again, a lot of this needs to be better synthesized, but one of the coolest results was being able to find that they are negative for high pathogenicity avian influenza through two major means of detecting them. Basically, one is a short-term means of detecting it, meaning that it says whether or not this bird has interacted with this pathogen in recent history or upwards of a year. So we're able to basically showcase that these birds haven't really contracted an infection from avian influenza within the past year or so. So it seems like these birds have a pretty, robust immunity against this really relevant pathogen. So that was really exciting to see. We did get a couple of hits for some of these various blood parasites, but they were pretty darn, I would say, low in prevalences. I was expecting that we would find more of them. So that's another thing that they might be able to be avoiding as they live in urban environments. Maybe the mosquitoes that transmit these different pathogens don't have them in their system and then therefore can't give them to night herons, or maybe night herons are hanging out in areas that have fewer mosquitoes. So again, that's kind of what we're interested in doing with some more environmental studies coming up in 2026. And I do have the results for the heavy metals in. I just need to work with my collaborator on interpreting those. So I'm very excited to, kind of tie all of those things together. This goes back to Evan's question about, competition. One of the other things that we're trying to do is encourage these birds to literally not put all their eggs in one basket. It's fabulous that they nest and have such a fruitful life at the Lincoln Park Zoo, but we really want to make sure that they are safe from, say, a random weather event, or if there is a contraction of some particular pathogen, we want to make sure that they're not all in one area so they don't all get wiped up in one, fell swoop, right? This is, again, the largest breeding population that we know of in the state of Illinois. So for it to be decimated would be catastrophic for this bird's conservation. So we're trying to basically create the sights and sounds of an active nesting heron colony in different spots throughout Chicagoland, including some spots close to where they've nested historically. So that includes putting up these decoys that you can see here. These are our original decoys. They were great egrets that were painted to look like black-crowned night herons. But our amazing friends at the Winnie City Bird Lab have been able to produce these 3D printed black-crowned night heron decoys. That's some amazing community members. Again, here's Amy leading this painting party. A lot of folks come together to do these little painting parties, and then we deploy these decoys out into different sites, including Big Marsh, Almond Marsh, Jackson Park, and Spring Lake. We also put out a call box. So again, it's kind of recreating all of this, the sounds, all the quacking, all the squawking and barking of a black-crowned heron rookery to try and entice birds to come and nest into these new areas. To no avail yet, but again, that movement data that's showcasing that they really like to stay close to the colony might be alluding as to why that hasn't been super successful yet. So we're kind of, again, thinking, how can we be creative? How can we maybe establish some of these content-specific nesting sites a little closer to the colony and just kind of, baby step it a little bit more, right? Because, Big Marsh, Spring Lake, a lot of these locations are a solid 30 to 40 miles away from the epicenter of the breeding colony. So we may just need to move in a little closer, maybe fabricate our dream nesting platform that is a fake river birch. We've got some options to exhaust here. And again, Amy and I have been, in charge of leading some really fun education events for the public. We did a really great collaborative project with River Lab, where we kind of did like this little urban wildlife conservation certification for kiddos. They were learning how to spot night herons in a scope. They got a lot of night heron coloring pages that I made, and we had these little 3D printed, Chicago Wildlife Watch or Defender. I forget exactly what it says, but if you're at all interested in becoming a black crowned heron watcher and basically looking out for any banded herons in any urban green spaces in and around Chicago, feel free to sign up with the QR code here. I know that we're a little far afield for where some of these birds may be hanging out, but if you're ever in Chicago, I highly recommend checking out River Park is one of the Herons' favorite spots to hang out. So again, as I wrap up my presentation here, some last thoughts. Just, again, where our head is at as a research group going into 2026. Really excited to finish analyzing and just kind of synthesizing those health samples. I'm really excited to hop on the phone with my collaborator with the heavy metal results and understand exactly what it means. I am by no means an ecotoxicologist, so I'm learning a lot throughout this process myself. I'm really excited for 2026. I think we're going to try and take like a year on, year off, year on, year off when it comes to health sampling. So next year I'm going to try and hit the health sampling for hatchier birds pretty heavily, as well as doing that environmental sampling that I was telling you all about. Of course, monitoring for banded birds on known foraging grounds and really just continuing that community engagement and building, connections to just general wildlife conservation narratives, ethics, ideas, excitement through the story of the black crowned heron, kind of having it serve as something of an umbrella species for other birds and wildlife in the Chicagoland area. And so with that, I think we're doing pretty good on time. So I think we got tons of time for questions, but just an enormous shout out to all of the names on this slide here. Nothing would be possible without them, and just an enormous thank you, especially to my amazing interns. Like I mentioned, I supervise, about 5 or 6 different students every summer, and each one of them has been just a marvel to mentor, and so many of them were here during our first banding sessions with the night herons, during our first, health surveys. And it's really special to share that with young scientists. And it's really special to share it with you all. So thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I got 2 questions, 1, 2, and 3.
I don't know if everybody knows, but Almond Marsh is the Lake County Enforcement Group site located in this lake. And it's been a heron rookery group. It's about 2009. Yeah, it's been a long time. They've got like maybe a dozen nests in there. I mean, you put up nesting platforms one time, other creeks, they didn't like it. But anyway, they're in, and they actually nest in the buffalo.
Yeah.
But that's a good site. That's easy to see. It's easily accessible. You can't drive down to park on the side of the road.
But were they there this past week?
And they put up monitors.
Yeah. I think my colleagues just took down that site. So thanks so much with your.
I guess we saw a juvenile. I saw a juvenile.
Yeah, I was expecting to be there. They've been there so many years. I don't know what happened.
I didn't see any adults, just one.
The herons, the great blue herons are in decline because of the cormorants, but
Yeah.
it's a little bit different habitat. The cormorants take over the nesting platforms on the
Right.
tripods.
Right.
The Audubon put up years ago.
About 9.
That was 9 acres. And then the black columns go in the trees, so.
Yeah.
And also with our Plover project.
Right.
We've seen on Lake Michigan, we've seen white crowned night herons, walking in the area, so
Fabulous.
they're declining a little because of the habitat with the visionary guys.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a black crowned night heron marsh in McHenry County? Over there, isn't there a marsh near there for these herons?
I'm not sure. There is a marsh out there that I think does have.
Or you mean by the Angle State Park?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a marsh, I forget what they call
How do you have a question?
Yeah, I just was wondering, how do you actually trap, especially the adult birds for the?
Yeah, fabulous question. I'll stand. How exact capture, especially adult night herons? It is an arduous process, but it was really inventive and fun. The short answer is we use a walk-in trap, which is kind of a remote activated chicken coop. So basically it's box made of 2x4s and chicken wire, about 8 feet deep and about 4 feet high with a remote activated door. And we have a little baby monitor camera at the back of the walk-in trap that we basically construct gradually over the course of about a month or so. So we kind of construct the frame and leave the door in the back off so that birds can kind of acclimate themselves to this very novel structure. Because while I will say the night herons in Chicago are some of the most habituated, not that they'll necessarily approach people, but just they are so comfortable with human presence. Some of those habituated birds I've ever seen outside of an ibis, literally in South Florida, coming up to like get, hot Cheetos from me. They love Cheetos in Florida. So these birds are not super flighty, right? But they are still very wary of new structures in their environment. So we give them a little bit of time, slowly, peek their head in. Once we see, and we have the baby monitors and wildlife cameras, like some of y'all have used in your backyard, and like my colleagues and I used to monitor wildlife all around Chicago. So we're constantly checking those cameras to see, oh, today we saw 4 birds go in. This is looking good. Put the back on. Let them get used to the back. And we are, throughout this whole process, we have a bucket of frozen smelt that we change on a daily basis to give them a little treat for their troubles. And then once we really see them interacting with the bucket pretty darn regularly, hopping in it, hanging out in there, and we'll say, let's put on the door and let's try to do some capturing. And so during capture, we have a baby monitor camera in a little bucket to keep it as clean as possible and weatherproof it next to the walk-in trap. And we have the monitor inside the main building of the Pritzker Family Children's Zoo. And we're just watching for that bird to go all the way back into the trap, start getting some smelt. And then, believe it or not, it's actually hooked up to an RC remote car, little RC toy car controller. We just pull the trigger and the front door comes sliding down, and then I army crawl underneath there and scoop it up and put it in a pillowcase to weigh it. The pillowcase is largely for obviously to help restrain the bird, but also limiting visual stimuli helps keep the bird a lot calmer throughout the sampling process. So we would do that for the adult birds, and then any larger and especially flighted juveniles, but typically, especially earlier in the breeding season, in June and July, I guess it's kind of late breeding season, but before the hatch years are flighted, it's pretty easy to just walk up and scoop the hatchery birds. Those are pretty approachable, and I can just go in and do that with my interns at any time of the day. The adults are most active. Even though their name says night heron, we're actually finding that, their diel patterns are much broader than that, especially during the breeding season. They're most active around like 5, 6 in the morning, actually. So we have to be up at the crack of dawn and put a good 4 hours of survey time in to get adult birds, but the hatchers are a lot easier to scoop up. Did I see a question over there? Any chance?
I don't know if you did, but I have one.
Great. I sensed it then.
Matt's my name.
Hi, Matt.
I was interested, Henry, in the health sampling you're doing.
Yes.
And the position of the black night heron in the food chain.
Yes.
Toward the apex. Granted, this would require postmortem
Sure.
study, but with respect to plastics in the environment, I know that impacts raptors. There's almost been no raptors studied postmortem without plastics in their plastic system. Do you have any sense for whether that's the case with the black night heron?
Sure. The short answer is I don't. We haven't done any plastic specific postmortem studies, really just for cost. So I wish I had a more fun answer for you. The short